Okay, so welcome everyone to the Summer Symposium on Early Childhood Research. My name is Lisa, and today I'm going to be presenting some work that my colleagues and I did using the Millennium Cohort Study to examine the longitudinal associations between children's expressive language ability and their prosocial behavior. Okay, so the idea that language ability and social development or social behaviors are associated throughout development is not a new idea, and a lot of the literature is focused around the associations between language development and problematic behaviors such as externalizing behaviors and aggression. So studies have found that there are associations from poor language development to increased externalizing behaviors. So for example, say we have two children and they're playing with toys, and one child, Ryan, has underdeveloped language, but he wants to turn with his playmate's toy. Now, because his vocabulary is limited, Ryan may resort to alternative forms of behavior to achieve his needs. So he might grab the toy or push his playmate out of the way to obtain that desired toy. Also, underdeveloped language can create frustration in attempts to communicate with peers, which can consequently result in problematic behaviors. Alternatively, the inverse association has also been found, whereby children who engage in higher levels of externalizing behaviors have poor language development. So again, we're going to take the case of little Ryan, and he regularly engages in problematic behaviors. Now this causes concern for his parents, who now focus their attention in the home on the reduction of this problematic behavior rather than on developing his language. So consequently, the language learning environment has been reduced, and language learning is supported by the social environment. So this direction of association is particularly salient in the early years of development. So now language and behavior development have been associated, and that's great, but there's been less focus on the potential associations with positive behaviors, so prosocial behaviors, which brings us to today's topic. Okay, so just before I continue, I want to highlight that I'm actually, when I refer to language, I'm talking about expressive language in particular, because language is very broad and it encompasses many different processes, for example, receptive, expressive, pragmatic. So today we're going to be focusing specifically on expressive language, and in terms of the definition of expressive language, it is the ability to label, express, and engage. So for example, the ability to label concepts, actions, emotions, the ability to express one's thoughts, needs, desires, and then also the ability to engage in successful linguistic dialogue and exchanges with others. Now, prosocial behaviors can be defined as behaviors that are empathetic and self-sacrificing. They're also helping behaviors. So examples can include sharing with others, being helpful or kind when you notice that somebody is hurt or ill, general acts of kindness, so praise, being complimentary towards others, and then also actions that facilitate inclusion within group settings. Okay, so what is the connection? How or why might we find an association between language and prosocial behaviors? Well, when we look at the definition of prosocial behaviors, we see that they're actually linguistically rooted behaviors. So in terms of theory, again, we have two possible directions of association. And the first would be a better language to facilitating more engagement in prosocial behaviors. So again, we're going to take little Ryan and we're going to say that his language is well developed. This leads to increased conversation opportunities for him, and these increased conversation opportunities for Ryan may lead to a better understanding of the perspective of other children. It allows him to engage in meaningful exchanges with other children, also to express his own needs in a positive way. So this may increase his desire to engage in positive, helpful, caring behaviors with others. Alternatively, high prosociality may facilitate better language development, and once again for related reasons. So now we're going to say that Ryan is socially competent. So he's going to engage in a higher level of prosocial behaviors, and this is going to lead his peers probably to like him more. So when children are liked, they have more interaction opportunities, and this leads to better development of their language because, as mentioned earlier, the language learning environment is supported by social development. So that would be, for example, the interactions that children have with their peers, with their parents, with educators. So more frequent social interactions are additional context for learning and potential increases in the child's vocabulary acquisition. Okay, so in terms of review of the available studies, we see three patterns of association. So the first is from language difficulties to a reduction in prosocial behaviors. And this literature is commonly conducted with children from clinical samples. So for example, children with specific types of language impairment. The second pattern that we see is from language competence to increase prosocial behaviors, and this is more commonly done with samples using the general pediatric population, such as the current sample. Now, it's just important to note that these patterns might seem intuitively similar, although they're not, because just because Ryan, for example, is a low engager in prosocial behavior, that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be a high engager in prosocial behavior. Now, the third general pattern that we find is no direct associations whatsoever. So instead, we find indirect associations, and in early development, typically these indirect paths are mediated through the parenting environment. Okay, so where are the gaps? Well, as mentioned, there's less work that's focusing on the association between prosocial behavior specifically and language development. And there's a lack of consensus regarding the direct association. So for example, there was two recent studies that were conducted longitudinal, and the first was by Rhee and colleagues and the second by Barnett and colleagues. Now both looked at language and prosocial behaviors, both using typically developing samples of children of around the same age. So Rhee and her colleagues found statistically significant direct associations whereby language at 14 months predicted increases in the child's prosocial behavior at 36 months. Whereas in contrast, Barnett and al. Failed to find direct associations between 12 and 36 months. So noteworthy, there are methodological differences between these two studies. So for example, Rhee and colleagues combined a measure of expressive and receptive language to yield an overall language competency score, whereas Barnett and colleagues ran two separate models. So they looked at the associations expressive language and prosocial, and then separately receptive language and prosocial. Also, Rhee and colleagues used direct observations to assess children's prosocial behaviors, whereas Barnett and colleagues used parent measures. To note, though, Barnett and colleagues did find an indirect association with language and prosocial behavior, which was mediated by the parent-child interactions. So what they found was that sensitive parenting predicted an increase in children's language and their prosocial behaviors, and in turn children who were more socially competent, more prosocial, and had better language had parents that were more sensitive to their needs. So in summary, there's three key issues with the literature. So first is we need to identify what language processes are exactly implicated in the association and how. The onset of the potential associations, and then the possibility of third mediating variables. So this brings us to the objectives of the study that was conducted, and the first was to examine the associational paths between children's expressive language and prosocial behaviors across a 2-year period, so from 3 to 5 years of age. And second, we wanted to examine the associations above and beyond the impact of previous factors that have been implicated in the literature that have been shown to affect both prosocial behavior and children's language development. So there are many factors, and the factors that we focused on in this study were children's nonverbal cognition, sex, positive parenting, harsh parenting, and then maternal depression. In terms of the methodological approach, we used data from children and their families from the Millennium Cohort Study, which is one of the largest population-based developmental cohorts with infants born between 2000 and 2002. Originally comprised of over 18,000 families that were sampled from across the UK. Now, we had attrition and item non-response, which is common in longitudinal studies. So our study only used a subsample of the 18,000 plus families. We included 14,004 children, which is 75, almost 76% of the initial families that were enrolled in Wave 1. And we used data mainly from Waves 2 and Waves 3, so at 3 and 5 years of age, when the children were 3 and 5 years of age, although maternal depression was collected when children were 9 months. So here is a table of the demographics for the entire sample and then those included in the current study. And you can see that the subsample are slightly from a more advantaged background. So a higher level of employment when children are 9 months of parents. Also, more children are coming from 2-parent families with parents that have higher level education, so 3rd level or above, and maternal age is slightly older in the subsample that we used. So this is quite common in longitudinal studies where families from a disadvantaged background tend to drop out at slightly higher rates. Because of this difference, we did run sensitivity analysis using imputation methods. So we used full information maximum likelihood, and we ran both models with the complete sample and then with the subsample. And our model results were very similar. The effect sizes were similar. The paths were in the same direction. We found no differences in terms of what was significant and what wasn't. So we used the 14,004 because Kenny recommends that when you use cross-leg modeling, you should use only cases with complete data. In terms of our measures, so our outcome predictors, we use the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, which we just heard a little bit about. So we use the Pro-Social Behaviors scale, which is a parent report. We use the British Ability Scale as a measure of children's expressive language. In terms of the covariates, sex was dummy-coded. Then we use the Bracken School Readiness Assessment to tab nonverbal IQ. We use the depression items from the Rutter-Melise inventory, which is a larger inventory of psychosocial distress. We used items from the Conflict Tactics Scale to assess harsh parenting. And then finally, for positive parenting, we use the infant-toddler home items from there. Okay, so in terms of our statistical approach, once again, we use cross-leg modeling techniques, which unlike multiple regression, don't impose a direction of association a priori. So we looked at three paths. We looked at the autoregressive path, which, for example, would be prosocial behaviors at 3 years to prosocial behaviors at 5. We looked at the concurrent paths, which would be, for example, prosocial behaviors at 3 years to language at 3 years. And then finally, we looked at the cross-legged paths, which would be, for example, prosocial behaviors at 3 years to language at 5 years. We present standardized betas as an estimate of our effect size. And just to note, we used a more stringent statistical threshold of less than 0.001 rather than 0.05 just because we had such a large sample size. In terms of our hypothesis. So first we hypothesized that we would identify an effect in the direction of children who had better expressive language at 3 to increase prosocial behaviors at 5. And we hypothesized that this would be our strongest effect in terms of the cross-legged associations. But because the social environment exerts a role on children's language development, we also expected that we would find the inverse association, although with a smaller effect size. So that would be prosocial behaviors at 3 to better language at 5. So in effect, we hypothesized that we would find a reciprocal effects model. And we expected that once the covariates were introduced, that our associations would hold. Okay, so here are our results of the bivariate model. So without any covariates added, the model fit, as you can see down here, was indicated that it was a good fitting model. So first we have our autoregressive, so here and there, and we can see that there is stability across time given the moderate to large effect sizes. Then we found a bidirectional association up here, so the concurrent path between prosocial behaviors and language at 3 years, suggesting that this association is already present early on in development. In terms of cross-legged, we only found one significant effect, so from language ability, so children who had better language were more prosocial at 5, although the effect is rather modest. Now, this is our multivariate model with our covariates entered. So the model fit down here, you can see it's slightly worse, but it's still in the acceptable range, so it was a good model. All paths remain statistically significant with the exception of the concurrent path from 3 years, prosocial and language. The paths revealed very similar effects even once the covariates were introduced, suggesting that the observable associations are still present over and above the covariates that we controlled for. And also we found a new concurrent path at age 5, so a reciprocal association suggesting that once formed this relation, this association may stabilize. So just to note, you'll see we didn't actually build a mediation model, and that's because with cross-leg modeling, it's recommended that you have at least 3 waves of data to test for full mediation. So instead, we decided, because we only had the 2 waves of data, to control for direct effects. And you can see that there were significant direct effects, especially on prosocial behaviors, with respect to all of our covariates, which may account for the loss of the concurrent path at 3. and then only nonverbal cognition and language. Okay, so in terms of our results, they both support and enhance the existing literature in important ways. So first, our results are in line with the studies that have actually in fact found direct positive associations between prosocial behavior and language. And given the large majority of studies, with the exception, plus a few more, of the ones that I mentioned earlier, a large part use cross-sectional design. So our study adds by showing that this association is actually present longitudinally. Also, all our results are in the context of the general pediatric population, which is nice because it means that we're able to generalize to a larger sample of children rather than just a smaller clinical subsample. So I just want to take a minute briefly for those of you who aren't necessarily familiar with cross-legged modeling techniques. So of course we're most interested in the cross-legged effects, as this is our research question. However, equally important with respect to understanding those cross-legged effects is the autoregressive paths. So the autoregressive paths, as I mentioned earlier, they deal with the stability of the construct, and the cross-leg depends on stability of construct in terms of the causal factor. So from a developmental perspective, this is actually very important because we would expect change over time in both of our variables of interest. So for example, a child's vocabulary from 3 to 5 is going to evolve and grow rapidly, we would hope, barring any underdevelopment. So the results do show sizable estimates of effect for both of our autoregressive paths, both prosocial and language, suggesting that individual differences within each construct change only moderately over time. So statistically speaking, the inclusion of the autoregressive path has now partialed out any previous variants of both children's language and prosocial behaviors at 3. And this leaves the cross-legged estimates to be based on residual variance. So this reduces the likelihood of the effects being just an observed correlation between language and prosocial behaviors when the child is 3. Okay, so in terms of the main research question, we found support for only one cross-legged association rather than 2, as was expected, and this was in the direction of better language to increase prosocial behavior. So this would suggest that early competence with expressive language, in particular, may increase the likelihood of children's engagement in prosocial behaviors across time, albeit the effect size is modest. So engagement in prosocial behaviors requires a certain level of language competency, as I mentioned earlier, because it's largely linguistically rooted. So therefore, there is theoretical support for the direction that we found of better language to increase prosocial behavior. And our study also demonstrates that the longitudinal association, the effects hold above and beyond the direct effects of within-child factors that were examined and also parenting factors that were examined. With respect to the practical implications of the current work, prosocial behaviors are a measure of children's social competence. And social competence has been largely associated with children's success within the classroom, both academically and socially. So if better language in the late toddler years has a positive effect on children's engagement in socially competent and prosocial behaviors, then language skills should really be a large focus in the home for parents and also within early childhood environments such as preschool settings, so for early childhood educators as well. Now, I just want to highlight some limitations of the current work. So even though in our study we used one of the most comprehensive population-based cohort samples that sampled across the UK that used different types of measurements, so parent report, observations, standardized assessment, which reduces any bias that could be introduced into the model as a result of shared method variance, we do have some limitations. The first is that our data collected on children's social behavior relied exclusively on parent reports. So the assessment of prosocial behaviors can actually prove challenging because of the inferences that are necessary. So for example, how do we know that a child is meant to be considerate towards others? Given that parents may be at a particular advantage in being able to make these inferences of their children's behavior, but the use of multiple informants in future studies would be beneficial. Second, but related, is the alphas for the prosocial scale. So our internal consistencies. they were actually on the low end of acceptable, so 0.66 and 0.68 at 3 and 5 years respectively. Now, one of the greatest challenges in using a measure with low internal consistency is that any associations found are going to be underestimated, and this is because they're going to be attenuated by the reduction of a maximum observable correlation that are allowed to happen. So we did find modest effects, and these effects might actually be underestimated, although underestimation is better than overestimation. So. Also, we only had data on expressive language in the Millennium cohort for this age group. So our results, while they're generalizable to the larger population, at the same time we can only speak to the associations with expressive language. We can't talk about how prosocial behaviors may be associated with children's pragmatic language, for example, so their understanding, which may actually play a very important role. Also, we can't talk about receptive language and prosocial behavior. And finally, we only had 2 waves of data, so waves 2 and 3. So as I mentioned earlier when I was discussing the model results, we weren't actually able to test a full mediation model, which would be highly interesting for future work to be done. In terms of just closing, so early childhood development is a dynamic process, as I'm sure you're all aware, that's shaped by many factors. So this includes both the within-child factors and the caregiving environment, so family, parenting, behaviors. Also, our results point to the importance of the interrelations between language development, nonverbal cognition, and parenting, and social development, of course. And then just in closing, programming efforts that are tailored towards enhancing positive growth in the toddler years are likely to be most effective if they target all dimensions of development holistically rather than piecemeal. So thank you very much for your time.